All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the trailer for Rim Dynasty, which is a brand new NBA history podcast hosted by me. My name is Lewis. I'll tell you a little bit about me. So I'm a Memphis Grizzlies fan. I'm a data analyst by trade. Basically been working in healthcare analytics for my whole career, but I have worked in basketball before as well. I did one season with the Memphis Tigers college basketball team in 2019 to 20, building automated pre and post game reports for one of the assistant coaches and also doing recruiting presentation, building them, not actually giving them to the student athletes. I don't think that would be legal for me to do that. But I used to have an NBA history podcast called Backfired, which was about bad teams, bad luck, and bad decisions in the NBA. A lot of you were probably listeners of that. I have a semi-large following on TikTok where I make silly little videos about basketball. You may know me as Coach Lou if you follow me over there. And I'm extremely obsessed with the Vancouver Grizzlies, so expect a lot of talk about them in this podcast because they are still active in this time period. So, okay, outside of the Vancouver Grizzlies, what else should you expect to hear when you listen to this podcast? So it's going to be primarily focused on the 2000s NBA. There's going to be some college basketball thrown in, some modern day NBA if I feel up to it, some Olympic and FIBA basketball if I can get my hands on some of those games. But primarily it's going to be a week by week look at what went on in the NBA of the 2000s, starting from the offseason in 1999. That's ahead of the 99-2000 season. And so what I mean by that is, for example, okay, episode 1 is going to cover, let's say, November 1st through November 7th of 1999. Episode 2 is going to cover November 8th through November 14th of 1999. Episode 3, 15th through 21st, and on down the line. What happened that week? What are the big storylines? What's happening on and off the court? Who's doing well? Who is playing poorly? Injuries. Big news stories, court cases, teams being sold, who's talking trash to who. Because it's so easy to just say, for example, from 2000 to 2002, okay, the Lakers were on top. Kobe and Shaq dominated the league. It wasn't close. But when you read the news and you check the pulse of the league throughout those years, it's not really a foregone conclusion that the Lakers are going to win the championship in each of those 3 seasons. In the preseason, before the 1999-2000 season began, the Portland Trail Blazers were the betting favorites for the championship for reasons that we'll discuss in the Pacific Division preview episode. In the 2001 season, the Lakers are second in the West to the San Antonio Spurs, who had just recently won a championship in 1999. And in March of 2001, the Lakers were the 5th seed because the Spurs, the Jazz, the Blazers, and the Sacramento Kings were all having really good seasons that year. In the 2002 season, they finished 3rd in the West to the Spurs and the Sacramento Kings. And of course, there's the Kobe and Shaq feuds that have been going on since Kobe's first year in the league when Shaq threatened to get Kobe traded to Vancouver, and the infamous Game 6 between the Lakers and the Kings that is very suspect. We'll get to that eventually. But the West was an absolute bloodbath this whole time, and that does, to me, make it even more impressive, of course, that the Lakers were able to win all 3 of those championships, because as we're going to discuss, there were some really fantastic teams in this era. Like with my previous podcast, Backfired, I'm going to focus on underrepresented stories. I'll talk a lot about teams that, I feel have been forgotten, players that may have been forgotten, because they matter just as much to me as the Lakers and the New Jersey Nets and Detroit Pistons of the era. And by the way, I promise, this is a guarantee, you will get much, much better at hoop grids if you listen to this podcast. That's a big part of the reason why I'm doing this, is so I can start getting top percentile scores on hoop grids. Maybe I should get the person who runs and creates hoop grids on as a guest sometime. But speaking of guests, I would like to have guests on. I have tentative verbal commits from a few people to be guests on here, but if there's somebody that you think should be on this podcast, let me know, or let them know, I guess, either way. Now, the reason that I'm doing a podcast about the 2000s NBA is that it is a huge blind spot in my basketball knowledge. It's a glaring hole, and I really want to rectify that. So this is a learning experience for me that I'm putting you all through. If you have listened to my previous podcast, Backfired, which I assume a lot of you have, you probably remember that, relatively speaking, I know a good amount about the 1990s NBA, primarily through the lens of the Vancouver Grizzlies. But the Grizzlies relocated to Memphis in 2001, so that's like a sharp cutoff for me is 2001, because that's just kind of when I stopped reading about stuff in my research. I was born in 1994, so I was a small child in the early 2000s, was not watching basketball then, was not a sports person growing up. I was really into Harry Potter and playing the trombone, not at all sports. Wasn't really interested in basketball until the late 2000s, 2008, when Derrick Rose was at the University of Memphis. And I still didn't watch the NBA for another 4 or 5 years or so after starting to watch college basketball. But yeah, from research that I've done for my own purposes, for past podcasts, I tended to focus on either the last 10 years or on the 1990s. So I wanted to have a really solid grasp on everything that's happened in the NBA since the 1990s continuously. And it's also a really fun time in the NBA that I didn't really get to experience fully. So I want to experience it. And, better late than never on that front. Now, with very few exceptions, like Karl Malone, for example, I'm not going to shit on players for being bad, because I want this to be a mostly positive show. I really like that newsletter, Enjoy Basketball, that's, positive and not negative, like a lot of current media coverage. I enjoyed doing my previous podcast, but it really got me down sometimes, particularly the Bison Deli episode, because I'm just not cut out to do a true crime podcast. But I'm going to approach this with whimsy and wonder and just marvel at how awesome basketball in the NBA and the individual players are. And so I hope that you will join me in adopting that mindset. I'm going to attempt to make it really easy for you to join me in doing so by making the games that I cover in the show available to the listener. So I have a good sized collection of NBA games that I've either bought from people online or downloaded off of YouTube. A lot of them are still on YouTube, but I download them anyway, just in case they get taken down. And it's a few hundred games, not huge, but I feel like it's a respectable catalog. I don't know. And one thing that I'm going to do is incorporate into the show for every week. I'm going to watch a game and talk about it in pretty explicit detail, talk about the two teams who are playing, what's going on with them, what makes this game significant. And I will say I have a lot of games that many might consider completely irrelevant within the grand scheme of things. Maybe it's a December game between two teams who didn't make the playoffs that season. But I really hate the mindset that regular season NBA games are meaningless, because for one, I really enjoy going to them. I pay money to go to them, and they mean something to me. I think that it's something that's really annoying about present day NBA discourse online in the media. I think every NBA game has some sort of significance. You just have to look for it. Some of these games are going to feature, a rookie version of a guy who became an all-star later, or a guy who had some significant off-court event happen to him. Maybe it's a revenge game for one of the players. The first player from a certain country is playing. Maybe the Clippers lost this particular game on a full court heave and then missed the playoffs by one game in some season. Every game matters. And so what I'm going to do, subject to availability online or in my hard drive, I'm going to pick a game, watch it, talk about it, and I will make it available to the listeners, whether that's by a Google Drive link or a YouTube link. But I want the audience of this pod to be a community that watches games and discusses them together, kind of like a book club. So I'm considering having a Patreon or a Discord for this podcast. If there's interest, I'll do bonus episodes where I watch another game from the same week, or potentially, take requests on a game to watch and discuss from any time period. So I'll be fluid on that one. But if you're interested, please let me know, and I would start a Patreon. I will say that would allow me to purchase more games from my vendor, as it were, and also recoup my costs of buying into newspaper and magazine databases that I use to do research for this show. So if you would be interested in bonus content on Patreon or just helping out with costs, I would really appreciate that. I'm not going to be pushy. I'm not looking to make money. I just kind of want to break even, But I also have some March Madness content when March rolls around in the time frame of this podcast. There are a ton of NCAA tournament games freely available online. Another thing that I'm going to do is post on Twitter and potentially Patreon images of newspaper articles, Sports Illustrated articles, Wayback Machine captures of NBA related websites from the early 2000s. The full text of a handful of articles as well. But really just show what it was like to sit down and read the sports section of the paper or have a Sports Illustrated subscription in the year 2000. So in summary, this pod is going to be nostalgic for sure, especially if you were watching the NBA during the early 2000s, or if you, like me, yearn for a time before smartphones. I hate how attached I am to the phone and the computer, even though I do love the immense access to information that I get as a result. This pod is going to be well researched. That is my pledge to you. It will be positive. I really want to incorporate audience feedback heavily because, I want this to be fun for all of us. So if you have any sorts of suggestions for, content, suggestions for segments of the podcast, suggestions for guests, there's a survey link in the description of this episode. It's 6 questions. Answer as many of them as you want. If you don't want to fill out a survey, but still have, any suggestions or comments, please get in contact with me. You can DM me on Twitter at RimDynastyNBA, on Instagram at RimDynastyNBA, on TikTok at RimDynastyNBAPod. You can call the podcast phone number and leave a voicemail. That's 405-466-7623 or 405-HOOP-MAD. And the links to all those social platforms are in the description of this trailer. But if you have a suggestion that makes sense and I have time to incorporate it into the show, I'm going to do it. So, I'm really looking forward to watching basketball together, talking about it, seeing what people were thinking about the NBA in the moment in the 2000s. Some of the takes in the papers and the magazines are going to look insane with, 20 plus years of hindsight on our sides. But, that's not going to necessarily mean that the person who made that assertion was stupid or misguided or anything. It just means that they were reading the tea leaves at the time and they got it wrong. So, for example, here's something from ESPN.com on October 6th of 1999. It is a Western Conference primer about what the biggest question for every team going into training camp is ahead of the 1999-2000 season for the Dallas Mavericks, okay? The key question is, can Steve Nash prove that he wasn't a horrible bust? Now, at the time, Steve Nash, who was the 15th overall pick in the 1996 draft by the Phoenix Suns, was entering his 2nd season in Dallas, his 4th season overall. In his 1st season in Dallas, he put up about 8 points, 5.5 assists, 47, 40, 83 shooting splits, and, starting 40 out of Dallas's 50 games that season. It's not fantastic, but it's not horrible. It's certainly not something that I would call a bust, especially as the 15th pick. But, whoever wrote that, there's no author listed. They had no reason to expect that Steve Nash was about to become an 8-time All-Star, a 2-time MVP, a Hall of Famer, one of the greatest point guards of all time. Because to that point, he was good, but he was a late bloomer, and he, may have bloomed the most, the latest, in NBA history. Who knows? Him, Jimmy Butler, there's others, that are in that conversation. But, we're going to hear things like that in this podcast. And, we're not going to pile on these authors, but we're going to appreciate how much more information we have now than they had at the time. With the Wayback Machine and all the newspaper and magazine archives that I have access to, there is a lot of information that we can pull. So if anybody has a question about the era, I probably don't know the answer right now, but I would love to hear your questions and research them and talk about them on the pod. So in addition to your suggestions, if you have any burning questions, let me know those too. DM me, leave me a voicemail, anything. So with that is the end of the trailer. I'm going to do a preview of all 29 teams in the NBA grouped by each of the 4 divisions, talk about, what that team added and subtracted from the previous season, how they did in the 1999 season, and then get right into the 99-2000 season, talk about the news of the week, and watch and talk about a game. First game is going to be the Seattle Supersonics at the Los Angeles Clippers in the brand new Staples Center. So I hope you'll join me for that. Let's watch some hoops together. All right. Thank you for listening. Bye now.